I wanted to do a little bit of talking about, I saw this little bit of a Gramsci dictionary in this one book I read. It's Approaches to Gramsci by Anne Showstack Sassoon. Sassoon, I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is a little bit outdated. I would say like some of it you can definitely feel its date or its age a little more than others. And because of that, if you see like a weird description in terms of how she describes it, understand that this is like, I mean, it is about 40 years old now. So even though like this was made a lot more for its time when Gramsci's ideas were really beginning to influence a lot of academic analysis of its time, especially in the 70s and 80s, this is kind of the space that they were in for it, right? So like for example, back when he was trendy, yes, exactly. He was a lot more trendy in the 70s and 80s in schools, for sure. Although a lot of that is also just due to like his circumstances, right? He wrote his notebooks from 1929 to 1935. He dies in 1936. And it takes until after the war. So by the end of the by the late 40s, then they began to like move his papers around and spread them around, and they got translated between languages and stuff like that. So like really these ideas, understand, they're mostly done from early like 30s to mid 30s, and they're not necessarily trying to reflect the period of like the 80s or the 90s, but they're supposed to reflect the 20s and the 30s, right? And it's very important to understand this because Gramsci is not necessarily a theorist who's more focused on finding a singular direct answer. In fact, Gramsci's whole thing was he kind of shied away from a lot of dogmatic thinking. In fact, his own interpretation of a lot of Marxist theory boils down to like viewing Marxism as a major modern revolutionary ideology that promotes action for the betterment of society, right? So even for his time, he was quite unusual as a Marxist. So you will see like if you're a Marxist who's primarily just read like just Marx or Engels, even if you've just read Lenin, he can come off a little strange or difficult to parse, both because he was under prison censorship. I didn't quite understand the extent of the prison censorship he was under until I looked at some of the letters that were saved. And literally each letter he sends out is stamped by the main prison guard. So it is literally like the prison guard was supposed to only sign it and stamp it after he thoroughly read everything. So there was a lot more active, like conscious censorship trying to, I guess, happening than I initially expected. But obviously, like it impacts like his concerns about it ever being stopped or cut off, right? I mean, yes, they definitely did. There was definitely situations where they skimmed it and then stamped it. But I think also like the vibes I get for the fascist leaders at the time, I think there was a bit of pressure in like if something gets out, it's your ass, like that sort of energy. So I'm sure that he was attentive, but I'm sure there was also opportunities where he's like, who gives a fuck what this boomer has to say? He's a fucking nerd. And I would assume it probably happens more towards the end of his sentence because that's when he begins to have a lot of health complications. And I think that's when they really kind of just go like, whatever, dude, you're dying. Who gives a fuck? So let's talk about a little bit of this. Americanism and Fordism. This refers to the development of assembly line production in the United States, most notably by Henry Ford. Gramsci was concerned with the significance for the working class movement of the introduction of the techniques of scientific management, as elaborated by the American Frederick W. Taylor, thus Taylorism, in a period in which this kind of rationalization of production was much admired in the Soviet Union. I talked a little bit about this, but Gramsci initially becomes fascinated with Ford's changes to his production lines because a lot of Fordist policies were incorporating a lot of very progressive ideas that would be, frowned upon or shooed away by most capitalists. But obviously, in order to do something like that for a capitalist, Gramsci was like, there's probably a lot more going on than just like they want to give him more money for, doing the same sort of work, right? And Gramsci's conclusion ultimately boils down to attempting to basically configure workers into their own sort of mechanized processes, their own sort of mechanized workers, that they can just do all the tasks at work without thinking or engaging with them. And more just like, the most automated, most straightforward method of doing this, which, is definitely efficiency, right? It's definitely a level of efficiency. But because it's from a capitalist, Gramsci was like, there's got to be something underneath here that's a concern, because it is a, traditionally very conservative capitalist methodology. The idea was more so about the reasons why a capitalist state would lean into these directions rather than just, purely rely on the same old methods, the same old tactics for developing these things, right? And Gramsci obviously gets a lot more into like the cultural view of it, how Henry Ford wanted his workers to be. Henry Ford would spy on you if you worked at one of his companies. And if you were gay, for example, or you did anything he did not like, he found a little deplorable, you would be fired, was essentially Henry Ford's method. So seeing all these things, Gramsci, takes interest in it, and that's why he begins to he commits a major section of the prison notebooks to Americanism and Fordism. Civil society, this is where Gramsci really starts cooking. Civil society, Gramsci defines this as the ensemble of organisms commonly called private, like private ownership, right? And contrasts it to political society or the state. While he differentiates the two areas, the relationship between the two varies in his writings. The state at times seems to encompass or at least balance the two areas of society, while the economy is included within civil society. Although Gramsci's frequent use of the term is evidence of Hegel's influence, he gives the term new meaning. He is interested, on the one hand, in the increasing complexity of social organization and social classes in the private or non-political arena in advanced capitalist societies, and on the other, in the consequences of greater state intervention in the economy and society in general. So basically on the what defines a society, what defines a state, because this is mostly guided by a Marxist perspective of looking at the masses, it's more so reflecting how political society interacts with the average person, right? The average individual underneath that system. Just as a very kind of brief summarization, these are concepts that require a lot of a lot of nuance and discussion. So understand it's a bit of a dry explanation, but it's because it's hard to talk about without getting into the root of philosophy or how people discuss the identity of a state. I'll give you an example comparing to Lenin. Lenin's view of the state was a lot more of an organization of classes, rules over a state, and guides that state towards their own class interests, basically, which isn't super disconnected from Gramsci's interpretation, but it's a lot more flexible in how it tends to analyze these things at the end of the day, is how I would define it, right? Collective will. This is organized collective human activity which intervenes in the historical process given certain material conditions. Gramsci uses the term, which refers to what he calls collective man rather than the individual, to refer to the creation of a new national popular identity and the need for a wide, active popular intervention in the process of creating a new kind of state. He does use it in a bunch of different ways. Basically, you could think of it as the collective man as somebody focused on establishing more class politics and things, for example, right? Trying to organize around class. There are cases where he does use collective man as a way of saying like the average person, right? The average person for that time. But understand that like he's basically one of the guys that begins to define a lot of these concepts that we don't really think about in that way, right? To further expand on this, you'll see what I mean. Common sense. The incoherent and at times contradictory set of assumptions and beliefs held by the mass of the population at any one time. Common sense is differentiated by Gramsci from good sense, which refers to practical common sense in its English meaning. Gramsci investigates the relationship between this popular conception of the world and philosophy, religion, and science. This is why I love him. I think it's a great analysis of it, and it's something that only becomes more and more true the ways you see, say, like the internet usage, for example, can help prove this, right? The incoherent or at times contradictory set of assumptions and beliefs held by the masses, he uses this across a wide network of the state, but the internet has allowed you to kind of separate it on another layer from like decentralized groups or communities, and how even common sense in these decentralized communities can vary radically depending on their own circumstances and communities. Like you go to one community on the internet, the common sense, belief there may be the earth is flat or something like that, right? Whereas if you go somewhere else, people would be like, what the fuck are you talking about? There are obviously individuals that can showcase this dynamic very well. And it's easy to kind of look at them and just be like, oh, what a dum-dum. He didn't understand what he was looking at. But Gramsci kind of denies this way of viewing it and instead focuses more on the process that people develop in determining this common sense, in understanding common sense, and how they develop their own sorts of common sense, right? And again, this may not sound spectacular for like today, but I need to stress to you, this sort of analysis in the 1930s is like, like it's gigabrain. It's actually gigabrain. It's so ahead of its time. I cannot stress enough how incredible it is to kind of highlight this sort of thing in the 30s, when there's a lot more superstition, to say the least. In fact, one of Gramsci's stories he tells when he's in prison is there's a kid that he knew from his neighborhood who swore to him that basilisks were real, like the monsters that like turn you to stone Dark Souls, like that sort of thing. And Gramsci like laughed at him and he was like, what the fuck are you talking about? You just made that shit up, stupid. And this kid gets so angry at him, and Gramsci, like getting yelled at, is like thinking about it, and he's like, it's kind of crazy how, despite the fact that I know it's the case that these things aren't real, it's crazy seeing someone else's reaction to who the basilisk being real is just, it is real. It is exactly how they view things. And they're not mad about being told that they're wrong. They're insulted that their interpretation of the world and their way of understanding it was not taken seriously. And I think about that a lot because throughout my life, I've basically seen that in a variety of ways too. We also quite literally see examples of this concept now from reactionaries using it to shield their beliefs. Yeah, exactly. Like nowadays, when you hear people talk about like, oh, why are you doing X fascist policy? They're like, it's just common sense that that's what people want, right? It's appealing to that feeling, to that identity. That is exactly what he's talking about, right? Again, I want to remind you, this is from 1930. This motherfucker was alive in 1930. It is one thing to be able to recognize this disconnection, but being able to like really analyze it at its root as like how it forms, where it forms from, how it portrays itself, it's both very ahead of its time but also really empathetic for its time too, which is kind of, it's a weird thing to say, but understand that this is an era of determinism and like mechanical understanding of things, that they think if things are bad or wrong, they will just work out as it should be. So even for him to like really be able to understand it and process this, it is quite impressive. Ruben talking about vaccines and the Jubilee and just not understanding reality. Yes, exactly. Like you can, when you see a conservative argue something like that on like argue insane things for like clearly no reason, Like, they cannot comprehend it or describe it or discuss it. They just know it. They don't understand how these things work. Their understanding of it is limited to the guy I like said this, therefore that. That's really what it boils down to. But because people are so enraptured in, like, especially sticking to guys that they view as, like, oh, this is my guy who gets me, right? When they hear that sort of guy say, oh, it's common sense, why this is, it's common sense, like, that's more speaking to them than it is like defending his own argument, right? It's reaffirming those beliefs for them. They are ways of preserving right-wing thoughts and conceptions of the world, not by arguing against them usually, but just by, like, hearkening to, like, a undescribed time frame where maybe that was the belief system then, maybe not now, right? But they don't really care about that. It's reaffirming that they're the copium dealers. They're the honest to God copium dealers. What I think Gramsci does the best about this is he analyzes it from religion, from science, and from philosophy. From each side, he tries to, like, analyze it, and he comes out, like, with 3 different views, and a lot of them basically boil down to, like, an influence of philosophers from the past that may have influenced trains of thought that have gradually developed into the average person's understanding of things. Even if it's fucked up, there are some things that just kind of from osmosis, from the popularity of how they're said or referred or referenced or whatever, they kind of, take bits and pieces of it, and that is their understanding of it. But because it's constantly reaffirmed externally through all these sources from a bunch of different views, a lot of the time people's understanding of it starts and stops there, because it's not necessarily understanding of things from analyzing it, from studying it, but it's more so from analyzing it from a lot of people said this is the case, which is where that banger Gramsci quote, the clap of lightning, comes from, right? Hold on, let me get that one because it's such a fucking banger. I love it every time. This is from redsales.org, from Study of Philosophy and of Historical Materialism from 1932. So much can be said for the influence of the thinkers and scholars. It is very great among the people, but in fact every conception has its own thinkers and scholars, and so their authority is divided. And further, any thinker may analyze and cast doubt on what he himself has said, etc. We can conclude that the process of propagation of new conceptions takes place for political, that is, in the last instance, social reasons, but that the formal elements of logical coherence, authority, and of organization have a very great role in this process immediately after the general orientation has taken place, among individuals as well as large groups. From this we can conclude that among the masses as such, philosophy can only exist as a faith. Besides, one may well imagine the intellectual position of a man of the people. He is made up of opinions, convictions, criteria of discrimination, and norms of conduct. Anyone who supports a point of view contrary to his is able, insofar as he is intellectually superior, to argue better than him and put him logically to flight, etc. Should the man of the people therefore change his convictions, because in the immediate discussion he is unable to assert himself? But then you would reach the position of having to change his ideas once a day, or every time he meets an ideological opponent who is intellectually superior to him. On what elements, then, is his philosophy based, and especially his philosophy in the form in which it has a greater importance for him as a norm of conduct? The most important element is undoubtedly of a non-rational character, of faith, but in whom and in what? Especially in the social group to which he belongs, insofar as it thinks broadly as he does, the man of the people thinks that on such a basic thing, so many cannot be completely mistaken as his opponent in argument would like to make him believe. That he himself, it is true, is unable to support and develop his arguments as well as his opponent does his, but that in his own group there are people who are able to do so, in fact, even better than this particular opponent. He remembers having heard the reasons for his faith expounded fully, coherently, and in such a way that he remained convinced by them. He does not remember the actual arguments and could not repeat them. The fact that he was once convinced, as if by a clap of thunder, is the permanent reason for the persistence of the conviction, even if he is no longer able to argue for it. Yeah, it's common sense. It can't be wrong, right? It's common sense. How could so many people be wrong? Everybody thinks it. It's not analysis of the systems, the methods, the dynamics above. It is superficially examining what a lot of people have said and affirming it. And that's it. If you are perhaps a minority group, you already know that hearing word of mouth for people assessing you not exactly accurate or fair or understandable, to say the least. Think of it like this: if you're someone who only relies on common sense to understand the world, how do you break from understanding what people have just said to you and that how that's wrong, how that's true? You can look things up, right? But if you look things up, how will you be able to understand things unless it's made painfully clear from that same sort of lens, right? If you say, oh, someone says the earth is flat, you subscribe to that, you begin to think about, like, oh, is that wrong? You look up stuff. If you see enough people talking about it in that way, maybe you would be like, oh, there's that same sort of common sense. There's commoner sense. There's commoner sense on the internet where they describe these elements, right? Maybe then they can understand it. Maybe then they can digest these things. Maybe then they can figure out where these things connect, but not from actually being able to analyze the systems. It's still using word of mouth. It's just using a level of word of mouth that they find appealing or sufficient. And it is something that does require some empathy to tackle, right? I wholeheartedly believe that. I think it takes a level of understanding to break people out of from this mindset, because it is a failure of education. If I'm being completely blunt, it is a failure of not being able to study things and figure these things out, right? And things like AI do scare me for how they can create similar problems, right? Corporatism. Gramsci uses this term to indicate political or trade union activity which seeks to protect the narrow, particular sectional interests of a group rather than the more general interests of the whole society. Also known as economic corporatism, it is related to economism. This is something that was relevant in his years as a organizer in Turin. It's basically like the trade unions at the time were a part of the socialist government, but a lot of the trade union leaders did not want to rock the boat with the government. And as a result, even when the workers were striking and fighting against the state, they would also be fighting against the trade unions at the same time because they were a lot more preoccupied with maintaining their positions of power. Because, I mean, if you're a higher up of the trade unions, it's quite a prestigious position to be in, right? I mean, a great modern day example of this is the Democratic Party in America, where there is not necessarily a fixation of ideology, but it's more about the political individuals involved in maintaining their careers rather than like rocking the boat and actually fighting against it, because they're not necessarily interested in the political gains or the ways that they can change society for the better. They're more fixated on maintaining their positions in the party, regardless of their popularity, right? So you can see what he's kind of pointing to. Corporatism in this way is more so like, it's referring to like being in a corporation of a higher position in trying to preserve your salaries and your own gains at the expense of the underlings, right? That's the sort of feeling it's supposed to invoke. And if it invokes a feeling out of you, then I mean, it's, you know what? Economism, a term that has a wide range of application. It refers to the belief that the economy, understood in a simple way, is the primary factor determining historical development in all other aspects of society, such as culture and politics. It is associated on the practical level with the defense of narrow corporate interests. Put simply, an economistic or mechanistic view of history assumes that history unfolds automatically, going in a straight line of progress as the economy develops. Economism is one of the main objects of Gramsci's criticism in prison because, according to him, it prevents an adequate understanding of the state and of social groups and of classes, and thus prevents the working class movement from intervening effectively. So again, this is more so like a further refinement on the analysis of the state, both from Lenin and from Marx, more so viewing the cultural impacts and the cultural pressures that kind of contribute to things such as common sense, how they are actually a major factor in understanding political divides and political mismanagement, we could say. And when I say political mismanagement, I mean in organizing, right? So a great example for this would be if you have ever met people who want to get more support from the government or like want universal health care, like some sort of something like that. It can range anywhere from like, say, I want to get something that makes my life easier to I want to get something that makes the community's life easier, et cetera, right? People will say that, and then they will divide themselves into a position where they acknowledge that, oh, we couldn't do free healthcare. Why? I don't know. It doesn't seem realistic. It doesn't seem possible. It doesn't seem like it could happen. Why? I don't know. That's it. Why? I don't know. This is kind of the crux of his argument of it, right? What's very notable about this is Gramsci was very, especially for the time, he was a very big organizer for like Italy, but Marxists in general. Like he was definitely one of the bigger organizers, a part of the Italian Communist Party. And I think that's why you can see like a lot more understanding of trying to educate people and like get them to understand where he's coming from. Because if you view things purely on the economic, then there are a lot of things that falls apart because there is a obviously important economic element to the development of state society, especially in capitalist societies. But the very common understanding of just being like, hey, if we just advocate for healthcare on its own, if we advocate for this on its own, you will always have people who say they're interested, but they have some sort of block. And this block often comes from the common sense, right? The common sense of this. It is a connection to where he points how this common sense and how culture can impact people's ability to engage with political systems and civil society. And because of that, he ties a line directly to how culture is such an important and prevalent part of organizing and also developing a new sort of society, right? This is the the bog dog one. Hegemony. Probably Gramsci's key concept and the one which is most controversial. Hegemony is used in the sense of influence, leadership, consent, rather than the alternative and opposite meaning of domination. It has to do with the way one social group influences other social groups, making certain compromises with them in order to gain their consent for its leadership in society as a whole. Thus, particular sectional interests are transformed and some concept of the general interest is promoted. Hegemony has cultural, political, and economic aspects and is the foundation of Gramsci's argument that the modern state is not simply an instrument of a class which it uses for its own narrow interests. Hegemony is basically just like it's more of the state's imprint on societal development over the years, right? A good example of this is also in how people interpret, like, think of state news or cultural news or financial news, whatever, all these things. They can be interpreted from the ways that they are sort of discussed and then, told to the masses, that some of them kind of take bits from it and then their understanding of it ends up being developed purely from a sort of common sense, not from actual education on it, but from a one-sided perspective of it. This is a little weird to understand today because everybody will probably understand there is a cultural hegemony that is present. There are a lot of weird dynamics that people have a lot of moral commitments to, even if their political ideology does not align with those things. This is like where you get a lot of conservatives who, when they get upset or like something wrong happens, they basically will like fall back on like liberal framing for things. Like, how could this be just? How could this be just? This is wrong, right? Let's say they support Trump. He's a rapist. He's a freak. If they have another politician who comes out with even similar sort of like identity, they will act like, pearl clutching. They'll be like, this is ridiculous. How could we ever have a rapist politician? Even though each day they advocate for those politicians, right? It is reaffirming a level of common sense that is from the hegemonic structure. But at the end of the day, it still shows you that just hearkening to those feelings, hearkening to those connections, shows you the hegemonic presence of this culture. What you consider good or bad, moral or immoral, there's a level of consistency across the world for it in a lot of ways. How these things are portrayed or how they get viewed or how they are even described can influence a lot from that. But typically, a lot of people work off of a single kind of linear understanding of these things and apply their own moral understandings of these things to them. To summarize it in simpler ways, you can see how people hearkening to liberal ideas, even if it contradicts their own systems and ideology and what they support actively, all of that does not matter at the end of the day. They will fall back on the hegemonic structure of it. It's not an accident. It works that way, right? So understand that it is kind of like a superstructure in of itself of the politicians feed into this understanding of politics and news and stories, which goes to the masses as a form of common sense built not out of understanding these subjects or these things, but instead built out of just hearing it and regurgitating it, regardless of if it's true or not. Historic bloc. Gramsci uses this term to describe the complex way in which classes and factions of classes are related in society and the complicated relationships between economic, political, and cultural aspects of reality. In Gramsci's writing, it replaces any simple notion of an economic base or structure giving rise to a political or ideological superstructure, which is the traditional Marxist metaphor. An historic bloc is specific to a national context in which a different historic bloc may be created under the leadership of a revolutionary class. The hegemony of a class is the glue which binds together the various parts of an historic bloc. A good example of this is in Gramsci's era, this was a lot more visible. We, in the 2020 era, we are beginning to see this, but there was a lot more separation, I think, beforehand. So a good way to describe this, and how he typically does describe this, is conservatives, instead of simply fighting to the death and giving up all their power, they may gradually assimilate more like-minded, say, liberal thinkers as conservatives as time goes on. Or let's say if conservatism is dying out on its own and liberalism is kind of growing out of it, liberalism may, grab more conservatives who ideologically align with some aspects of it. This isn't to say that there is a sort of like removing the dynamics of class from this, but it's essentially making a block of different classes or ideologies to organize a level of sort of maintenance of power and of also directing its identity. So what this means is, if you've ever seen in the past where someone may identify as like a socialist, but then, practically he's just a liberal, right? Or like sometimes even a conservative. Sometimes these things, if digested individually, would just make it look like these individuals would be, abnormalities in the system. Gramsci basically denies this and says that it is more of a historic display of a variety of phenomena and events. So one thing that he points to is basically the Risorgimento, which is the Italian unification of the 1800s. And basically in there were a lot of progressive blocs that formed to do a form of revolution. But a lot of the times it would be like these progressive blocs would be mainly liberals making concessions to the petit bourgeois and to conservatives, as opposed to actually leaning into socialism. It would be more of an expansion of the system or of a group, including another group, than actually doing any sort of monumental change. And this is an important part, and we'll get to why in a moment here. But intellectual and moral reform. This is a transformation of the way in which the mass of the population conceptualizes the role of the individual, his/her place in society, in relationship to other human beings, to God, to the economy, and to politics. It is a change in the conception of the world held by most people comparable to that brought about by the Protestant Reformation or the French Revolution. So what he's talking about, and I think it's a great job that the writer of this actually indicates the French Revolution. I think that's a key detail for it. It is a sort of massive cultural shift out of historic events. So a good way to kind of tie this to the modern day again would be how there are a lot of people in like the 2010s, 2020s who are a lot more interested in socialism, for example, who would identify a lot more as a socialist, right? It's not necessarily that something specific happened, but it's an accumulation of a lot of failures and a lack of receiving things, I guess you could say, that ends up contributing to a major kind of collective shift in the masses' understanding of politics. Sometimes it can be born out of individual reasons or even spite or all these other things that contribute to common sense, as we've discussed. But at the end of the day, what it's mostly talking about is a sort of organic, natural shift of the masses and how that can contribute to a new sort of structure of society or of even religion, as he highlights there, right? So you could think of it more as like events that contribute to change the way the masses view their culture or understanding of culture, usually born out of being forced to reckon with the contradictions, which is very common for a lot of capitalist democracies that are mostly parliamentarian. Yeah, like a paradigm shift. Like a microdose example of this in American politics would be elections themselves. You may go into an election thinking, oh, we had a Democrat for 4 years. This Republican for 4 years may do something different and may do something better, right? If the Republican does the same exact shit as the Democrat, either you have to reckon with these politicians are bad representatives of their system, or you have to look elsewhere. Maybe the system has failed you. Maybe the structure has failed you. Maybe something else. This can keep happening until you're in a position where you have to either reconcile with you were wrong, and these sort of dynamics or situations are a lot more complex, or you just didn't understand them, whatever. But typically, because parties can, like Dressage said, act as a certain pressure valve for it, it can be kind of dissolved into the individuals of politics or like the president, stuff like that. But that same mass cultural shift is exactly what he's talking about, just on a very, very minor scale. You could argue that if people began to get more revolutionary, more resistant towards government institutions or structures, you could consider that a lot more of an intellectual and moral reform in the way that they're talking about it here. It's more so just being exposed to events that you may have been told will go one way, they go another. You have to reconcile with the contradictions. When this happens on a mass enough scale, it will create a massive amount of change for the average person. Intellectuals, organic and traditional. First, Gramsci uses the term intellectual in a broad sense to indicate all those people who have an organizational or ideological cultural role in society, e.g. school teachers, factory technicians and managers, civil servants, social workers, university professors, journalists, etc. He then differentiates between organic intellectuals who perform tasks essential to the reproduction of a particular society, e.g. a capitalist one, and traditional intellectuals whose function derives from an earlier historical period, e.g. priests, but who continue to exist. Moreover, Gramsci relates the functions of all intellectuals to a capacity inherent in every human being, the ability to think and reason, which becomes a technical skill in certain people through study and practice. He views traditional intellectuals as a skill set built out of this, like the system, the state, as a form of maintaining the state. Having an ideological, philosophical description or definition of something that is enforced and encouraged by the state. Organic intellectuals that he kind of indicates can be anywhere from like it can be literally everybody. He says that every person is an intellectual because every person's got the function of an intellectual. You have the skill sets of an intellectual, which means if you're able to engage yourself and think about things like an intellectual, you are an intellectual, right? To just simply think about things and engage them and think about them and study them, that is being an intellectual. That is doing an intellectual process. Whereas maybe sticking to dogmatic thinking, sticking to like a way of the world that was formed years ago or, hundreds of years ago, all these things used as the means of essentially reinforcing the state, right? Like if there's a huge involvement of religious life in the state, the maintenance of priests for giving an education for this intellectual field, he considers that a separate form of intellectual, a traditional intellectual. What he's saying is anybody can get good. It's just if you focus too much on the structure or the image of what it means to be an intellectual and you get caught up on the optics of it, then you're not necessarily engaging things. You're giving yourself excuses, is kind of how he would put it. Because you do have the process of functioning as an intellectual. You just may not have the drive to study something. You may not have the interest. You may not have the time, whatever. But no matter what, it is not the exemption of these things that removes your capacity to be an intellectual. If you take away tools from a repairman, he does not lose all his skills. He knows how these things work. It's just his ability to just interact with them, put these theories to process and action, that is different. Jacobinism, a term derived from the kind of leadership exerted by the Jacobins in the French Revolution. Its use by Gramsci and his attitude to it changed as his view of bourgeois revolutions changes. In his earlier writings, he criticizes the authoritarian leadership of Jacobinism viewed as the imposition of leadership by an elite. Later, while criticizing what he considers a deleterious version of Jacobinism, he emphasized the ability of the Jacobins to forge alliances and establish a new state, enjoying the consent of the mass of the population and engage in constructing a new society. I would say it's a little bit of an unfair analysis of the Jacobins. I mean, they were absolutely associated with, a level of brutality. But there is also a reason why a lot of Jacobins were kind of idolized for their strict leanings to laws and regulations, right? Regardless of the extremes of it, I guess you could say. But it is worthwhile just for noting that Gramsci's main issue with it is not necessarily in the structure of the government or methods that they actually even do, but more so that he believes in a lot more of a connection to the masses, which typically when people say things like this, they're beginning to lean more towards speaking about it in terms of like anarchism or like level of democratic socialism or social democracy, for example, which is also why a lot of the times people tie him to being a liberal in writings for what it's worth. But it's more so that he just believes that you need to maintain an understanding of the masses and guide them to a level of understanding, because the more separation between the masses and the leadership, the more that hegemonic structures and cultural understanding of their society, it does not work, I guess you could say. National popular. This refers on the one hand to the ability or inability of intellectuals in the wide sense to relate to the needs and aspirations of the mass of the population, and on the other to a view of the revolution as a struggle to unite a whole people against a small minority of exploiters and oppressors, thereby creating a new national identity. The question of the nation and of specific national traditions and the needs of people at large are thus essential to the working class rather than marginal. Revolutionary transformation is redefined to indicate a change in which a variety of groups participate under the hegemony of a working class which is able to forge a new historic bloc and go beyond its own narrow sectional interests. When it begins to develop beyond just like action and begins to build itself a national identity. It's easier to understand when you view it from the intellectual and moral reforms dynamic of it. He talks about how people changed the way they viewed themselves from the French Revolution. Whether or not they had an ideological commitment that was fulfilled by the French Revolution or not, they experienced a level of change in cultural view that shifted from the French Revolution by its own history, by its own events that happened, right? National popular in this way that it's used is more so about kind of building an understanding or a level of theory, both for engaging with the masses, but also establishing a kind of popular culture for the masses after a sort of revolutionary event. Sometimes even before it. If, say, like a Marxist group begins to get major dominance in the West, and it begins to spark like a major shift in popularity for Marxist parties, developing an understanding of the world from a Marxist lens as a sort of party culture would be in this way, right? It's not just limited to the state, but also in all organizational capacities. Like in China, yes, there's a few different ways it could be viewed, right? For China, that is. But the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't necessarily playing into the same ideas that Gramsci is talking about, but it was trying to work towards the same attempts of like redefining what is culture for people, what feels right, what feels like best. It's just, I would say their methodology was a lot different, right? Gramsci was a lot more willing to meet the masses in the middle of it and try to like work that out with them actively. A lot of other socialist revolutions who have done a form of cultural revolution were not as generous, we'll say. But it is worth noting that the circumstances in like Russia or China are very, very separate and very, very different from the circumstances in Italy. Yeah, I mean, like it's a lot more understandable, right? And I think it kind of goes to the root of like why there is a separation of understanding from the West and the East in terms of Marxism, like where their histories kind of converge and where they separate themselves. Yes and no, like in China, is my point, right? They were trying to do the same thing, just in very different ways and under very different circumstances. Here's another banger. I don't think we ever got to talking about this from his notebooks, but I'm excited for us to start learning about it because it's such a banger. Passive revolution. This is a notion derived from conservative tradition going back to Edmund Burke, who argued that society had to change in order to stay the same, i.e., to preserve its most essential features, or as they like to say, the more things change, the more they stay the same, you know? It indicates historical changes which take place without widespread popular initiative from on high. Gramsci uses it to describe both specific historic developments, for example, the establishment of an Italian nation-state, and a style of politics which preserves control by a relatively small group of leaders, while at the same time instituting economic, social, political, and ideological changes. Yes, it's top-down change that could even clash against their ideological commitments. It's a means of implementing changes without disturbing the power dynamics. Yes, it's a means of kind of implementing changes, usually positive ones, kind of in a drip feed way, I guess you could put it. A good example of a passive revolution for America would be the healthcare that Obama wanted to institute that would be more like a universal healthcare like in European countries, Nordic model. What Americans got instead was Romney Care, which was like a state-run program that kind of developed from a state subsidy, is a good way to put it. It's a state subsidy over your healthcare that is defined by how much your state wants to engage with it. So a passive revolution, you know, separate from what it says here, right? It indicates historical changes which take place without widespread popular initiative on high. Again, in America, there isn't really great long-term examples that are separate from pressure, because the overall structure is basically designed to infer this, right? And to do this, I guess you could say. But think of it more just from how I like to describe it, just as a very simple way of putting it. Slow reforms, they're not really what was desired from the population. It's a crumb of healthcare, like you said. More so done to maintain an ideologies or a group's grip on power, even if it goes against their immediate interests, right? Like conservatives voting for statewide Romney Care or whatever. Obviously, they will go back to trying to weaken these sort of structures over time, despite their vote for them. But they do these things to maintain their presence in power. This was a lot more relevant in an era where there was mainly, kingdoms and shit, or like a level of like aristocracy that was just entrenched in things, or like kind of semi-republican states that were formed out of the time. The concept of how it plays out is still very real. Yes, the Tsarist reforms would have fallen under this sort of category. And it is a great example because it is something that, because he did not necessarily give them everything they wanted and he took it away after, people were already like, well, he gave it to us just to take it back. Obviously, we're not going to do that again. But the benefit of passive revolution is that it can be very progressive policies that are built out of trying to just kind of build a understanding or a sort of an idea of, we're trying to do this for the betterment of society. I think of passive revolutions as a great way of a group to basically press the button that says, we still care about you, when they're in a position that may be not super flexible for them, right? It's the emergency button. It can also kind of correlate and connect to like cultural developments as well, not just directly political changes themselves, but mostly it is used in the capacity of pointing to small scale reforms, even if ideologically they're very separate and considered extreme for their ideology. It is done to maintain their grip on power, is basically the root of it, right? Revolution as process. Rather than viewing revolution as a dramatic break after which the new society begins to develop from scratch, Gramsci maintains that revolution must be understood as a process which begins within the old society and continues after moments of dramatic change. An old society will be destroyed in all its aspects only insofar as a new one is built and consolidated. Put differently, a revolutionary movement will be able to destroy the old only by building qualitatively new social relationships. In addition to this notion of construction-destruction, revolution as a process related to Gramsci's view that a socialist revolution must be made by the mass of the population, not by a small elite. This is something that feels a little weird to read today. It may not seem particularly relevant, right? It may not seem particularly like huge of a concept. Again, though, I want to comment, for understanding something like this in 1920 or 1930 is fucking insane, because this is like such a departure from most other understandings of revolution at that time, where there's a lot more of a mechanical determinist understanding that things will just work out this way because people will feel one way eventually and it'll just happen. Understanding revolution more as a bunch of different events that all contribute together to build a revolutionary movement and a revolutionary fervor that can be highlighted as an individual event is like, it's obvious when we think about it today, because it's like you can see there's a bunch of different breaks and different understandings of how these things work or function, right? But again, for the time, this is a really incredible analysis of it that I will affirm to you as someone that reads Gramsci from 100 years ago and sweats about random history books about World War I to World War II to, I guess, even the 1800s. I promise you, he is fucking spitting. He is so spot on that it's a little scary, to be honest. Last page. Spontaneity. Gramsci argues that what appears to be spontaneous social or political activity, i.e. without any leadership, is always under the de facto, even if only implicit, influence of one or more sets of ideas, leaders, etc., and therefore that true spontaneity does not exist. At the same time, he suggests that political leadership can only be effective if rooted in a mass movement whose complex and contradictory spontaneous ideas and actions are understood and whose positive attributes are developed. For the time, it was a lot more of a, left comm or more of an anarchist kind of point of view of, there is a level of class consciousness in a lot of people who, if the right event happens, they will just be invoked into action or invoked into doing something. I guess it's still somewhat talked about today, but not really in the same way. Gramsci kind of uses this in a way that, it does break the ankles of some left comms of that era, because he's basically saying that people are not necessarily organized into an ideological understanding of the world, but their understanding of politics is in the form of an instrument of one politician who they recognize advocates for their interest. And so their ideological understanding and worldview is more so let and built on the understanding of this leader or their ideas than actually anything else separate from that, which means the spontaneity that a lot of like left comms of the era advocated for, basically he's calling them Caesarist, like he's calling them Bonapartists in a lot of ways, I guess is a way you could put it. A sort of progressive Caesar is the way that he would probably describe this. So you can see his own understanding of organizing is not just built in organizing a lot of people to develop like an ideological understanding that's principled, but also like understanding that because a lot of people's worldview is built out of common sense, which is a bunch of different bits picked from random areas of the world or philosophy or whatever, their worldview is not going to be solid. It's going to be very amorphous, I guess. It'll be very flexible in ways that will not make sense outside of the person's own mind and how they justify it to themselves. When you consider this and you consider spontaneity as an action, right, of like doing actions to bring a sort of reaction without actually organizing them on an ideological level and educating them about why this is bad and why this does not work, he's basically saying that you're not really doing a revolution. You're ultimately just mobilizing a level of discontent that is apolitical and more connected to the individual needs of people. Expanding on that, you can think of it like if you're only engaging them on individual needs, that's how you build fascist organizations, right? Like that's how fascists tend to develop their own power. It is a bit of a banger critique. Statolatry, literally meaning state worship. Gramsci uses this term to indicate an almost religious belief in the state's ability to bring about social transformation rather than the self-governing activities of the mass of the population. This is where I got altered, by the way, when I was a kid. Well, not when I was a kid, but when I was like a teenager, I guess. I was literally that. I was like, if they're in state power, why wouldn't they want to make things better, right? Doesn't this seem like weird? Why would you get into politics to not improve things? I could not even fathom it. And then I would talk to people about politics, and that's when I would see the common sense aspect really pop up. There would be like a worship of like American identity, for example. Well, at the same time, they're like, America's great, and I love living here, and I love what America does. I just wish this war in Iraq would end so my brother can come home. Subaltern slash subordinate. This does not just mean oppressed, although that may be the case, but lacking autonomy, subjected to the influence or hegemony of another social group, not possessing one's own hegemonic position. In a lot of liberal societies, there are shit tons of examples of this that gradually shift over the years. And this is a better way of understanding, say, passive revolutions. Obviously, like the more oppressed group you're a part of, it goes without saying, right? Like you can classify the like African Americans throughout American history as their subaltern group, but it doesn't necessarily just mean like a level of incredible oppression on that same level, right? It could just mean that, say, like oppression against another hegemonic structure. So, say the church talking about gay marriage, right? Or trans stuff. I mean, in this same sort of idea, even separate from the example of like slavery and all that, you can view this sort of idea in the states, how they used to reflect on, like, say, interracial dating or marriage. It's kind of like that. It's a little more of a cultural position that is oppressive to groups, more so built on their own existing bigotries and own existing hegemonic beliefs. It's more so just describing underneath a society, an oppressed class that is actively oppressed by the state, even if it's in something as little as just like cultural propaganda, right? Like just allowing cultural propaganda to flood out and impact people's lives, or it can be as extreme as physical oppression and violence. It's not indicating the severity, it's just indicating the lack of autonomy in that field and the pressures, especially from a outside, usually hegemonic, usually larger in structure, power, etc., group to oppress this or enable this, right? This is obviously from his own experience as a Sardinian in Italy, right? It's like which groups are wielding the levers of power. Yeah. So like in Gramsci's case, as a Sardinian, there is the North and South divide. So there's already a cultural imbalance that clashes between the two where they're both antagonistic to each other. Sardinia was like the third layer of this, where it was a part of the South, but it was considered particularly separate from the South at the same time. If you were in Sardinia and you wanted to involve yourself in Italian politics, you would probably include, say, like the South, or you would just indicate Sardinia specifically. Whereas a lot of people who were from the South but not from Sardinia would maybe want to kind of omit that Sardinia was a part of the South. Like they're the really bad ones, right? Like we're all right in the South, but like the really bad ones are in Sardinia. There's a level of domination that is enabled and kind of further propagated throughout like cultural, political, economic structures, right? All these things. How these can be used for the sake of oppression, it can vary significantly. But what matters is basically that there is one hegemonic leader of the region. There's one dominant figure that can control these things and controls the levers of power. And there is a group underneath them that lacks the same autonomy to even act outside of that hegemonic structure. War of movement, war of maneuver. This is one of Gramsci's frequent military metaphors. It indicates a frontal confrontation or the kind of struggle associated with the 1848 revolutions in Europe or the 1917 revolution in Russia. The images of manning the barricades and destroying the enemy as a result of a sharp clash between easily definable forces. Gramsci argues that this kind of strategy is appropriate where the state and civil society are less developed, so that the political power is more fragile, and mass trade unions, pressure groups, and party organizations are not yet developed. It is not yet a suitable strategy, he says, when faced with the more complex conditions of the interventionist state and mass organizations of modern advanced capitalist societies, where state authority is based on some degree of mass consent. The war of movement or dramatic and possibly violent struggle may still occur, but it recedes to being a moment within an overall strategy of war opposition. I think the military metaphors for understanding like revolutionary organization is a really good way of putting it, because I think people don't necessarily understand the things they advocate for unless it's worded in ways where they can just feel the direct, like, oh, this is bad, you know? What Gramsci's pointing to here is basically like a head-on, direct revolutionary confrontation between Tsarist Russia and revolutionary forces underneath. What is noteworthy is obviously there were political parties, but it's more so that they were just kind of like underground sects and like divisions of groups than anything else for a long time. It's noteworthy because trade syndicalism was a lot more relevant in his time frame, where the methodology of attaining a socialist revolution was more seen as viable through gaining enough power in trade unions and using that as a means of taking control of factories and expanding your power that way, right? What he's kind of saying is these are a lot more direct confrontations of just two sides clashing against each other, and in one battle, one side just wins, right? It's a very direct linear battle, right? It's like watching a medieval battle, basically, without the organizational capacity of parties and using parties as an instrument of organization in Western capitalist societies, that you will end up encountering a lot of issues that, say, Russia or China did not experience in the same sort of ways. And that is true. Because again, even if we just view, say, cultural revolution, the brutality and the excesses of brutality that were very common from class interests back then, they did not try to hide it, really. Whereas like in the West, it was a lot more of dissecting common sense, like misunderstandings of actual events than anything else from Gramsci's experience. So he basically relates these two things. He does not necessarily argue against the validity of a war of movement, right? He indicates there are situations or positions where war of movements are powerful. The indications of 1848 and 1917 are both specifically indicating a level of like feudalist presence and identity still. A war of movement is the most simplistic way of forming a revolution, of spontaneity, of a bunch of people just knowing there's something wrong and there's a big issue. And when the right thing happens, they will just go and meet the moment. The view of how, like, if the right, like propaganda the deed, if propaganda the deed happens, then there will be a revolutionary spirit that forms out of it. That sort of spontaneity that he talks about, he uses in military metaphors here more to indicate that it is the equivalent of like you see an organized enemy, you line up all your soldiers and you just crash into the castle and you just hope it wins. I'll just say history does not agree so much with a more spontaneous organizing in this capacity, which is probably why he's indicating it in this way. If you say strategize around battle, right? If you're strategizing around how do you take a castle, do you force your way through and just try to break the castle? Or do you try to say, I don't know, encircle them and starve them out, right? Like that sort of thing. This is why he uses the military metaphor for it. When you view it in military terms, immediately you're like, this is fucking stupid. Why would you ever do that? You know, why would you just, as soon as you get enough troops to do the battle, why would you just do the battle and hope it works? Yeah, it's an all-in strategy. War of position. Gramsci argues that a war of position, or a kind of political trench warfare, is necessary because of the nature of modern state power. It is a struggle which engages on a wide range of fronts, in which the state as a normally defined government, parliament, etc., is only one aspect. Involving all aspects of society, it is the only decisive form of engagement, not least because it is a form in which bourgeois power is exercised. It involves a wide-ranging social organization and cultural influence. It is only victory on these fronts which makes possible or conclusive a frontal attack or war of movement. Gramsci says that a war of position continues after the transformation of state power and while a new society is being built and consolidated. So you can see Gramsci's understanding of revolutionary theory, it's a lot more expansive, not just on forcing a revolution, but also building a new revolutionary mode or moment in history. This is where he really cooks. You can see he's not obsessed with trying to force a revolution to make things better now, but he wants to make a long-term, successful revolutionary project that changes the way the world is interacted with and seen, in the same way of the French Revolution, right? It's clear that he views it a lot more of a revolution is not just a revolution on the stage of action, but of also ideology, of theory. It spurs you to the moment a little more, right? Whereas maybe for some people, the revolution's over. They're like, this is great, 2 thumbs up. Which, it's funny he puts it like this, because that is kind of the Paris Commune, to be honest. Even in a lot of his analysis, he engages with the same sort of historical precedents that Lenin was for his own analysis for building the Russian Revolution. And I think that's where you can really see what really makes him cook. It is fire writing.